Welcome to my TCG Story. This is episode 4 of the Rivals Season 2. In the previous episodes, we've talked about all the story and the encounters and a couple of other things. Today, we're going to be talking about the rivals that you meet. So, this is the reason why the whole season is called Rivals, the storyline, because the two rivals that you have the whole game is Thornton and Irida. A player will first meet these two characters in the first play session when they're at Professor Juniper's place and they've got their delivery assignment. When leaving her place, they will meet Irida usually first and then Thornton second and have a chance to battle them. So today we're going to get into their decks and the archetypes that they use and the progression that happens throughout the story. Because as you remember, this is meant to be a long-term RPG-style version of Pokemon using the cards. And so as a player acquires more and more Pokemon and trainer cards, they're able to make their deck better, so the rivals need to be able to have better decks as you progress with them. So Irida, as a trainer, started her journey with her trusty horsey. And as she progresses through the game, as you level up and progress through the story, her horsey evolves into Seadra, and she gets more and more powerful versions of Seadra and Kingdra. And so the way that the story progresses is that I have different versions of the deck that use some of the same cards, and depending on how powerful the player gets in the play session, I will change how powerful the trainers are. So, for example, Irida starts out with just a 30-card deck, and it's just a really simple deck, but then as she progresses, that 30-card deck turns into a 60-card deck, and then eventually becomes what I'm calling level 100 60-card deck. And so the way that I built this out was I first figured out what cards and Pokemon I might be able to use and which ones I have like an evolution tree of. And then I figured out kind of what the final deck will look like as well. So I started with the final deck and then worked my way backwards, but then also figured out some of the stuff in between. So my first thinking was I probably would want to start off with some of my better Kingdras and Seadras. And this is the Seadra that uses the Swim Freely ability. So it can take advantage of Finneon's oceanic accompaniment, which allows you to, you can attach as many water energies from your hand to your Pokemon that have the Swim Freely attack. So Seadra has that Swim Freely attack, and then the Dugong also has that Swim Freely attack to be able to dump your energies down. And so that's where I kind of started with the deck, and then I kind of figured out what other Pokemon and trainers and stuff like that. So let me show you. Let's go over this first. So one of the things that I did is I tried to have like 6 main Pokemon. So Irida starts with Seadra, Horsey, Seal, Mischievous, Staryu, and Finneon. And then as she progresses, her Pokemon either level up or get more powerful. So for example, this Seadra here, its big attack just does 50 damage. And then its Muddy Water attack does 20 damage, and then it does 10 damage to one of your opponent's bench Pokemon. But then once you battle Irida in the second stage, here, she's got now a Kingdra, which can do some attacks, and her Seadra's even gotten better. This Seadra does 30 damage to one of your opponent's bench Pokemon. I don't know if that's necessarily better, but it's different. But now she has Kingdra with 2 different attacks. Brine, this attack does 90 damage to one of your opponent's Pokemon that has a D damage counters on it. And Tornado Shot, 90 damage, and you can discard a water energy from this Pokemon. This attack does 30 damage to one of your opponent's bench Pokemon. Another way that you can see this progress is she starts out with Seal, and then later when you battle her, her Seal has evolved into Dugong, which has the Swim Freely attack. It can prevent damage. And then the Flow Return, 40 damage, times shuffle any amount of water energy from your Pokemon, so not just this Pokemon, into your deck. This attack does 40 damage for each card you shuffled into your deck this way. So Dugong is one of her big attackers early on, and then later she drops the Dugong altogether and only has Kingdra, but she's got other Pokemon. So another example is her Staryu evolves into Starmie. She gets a more powerful version of Staryu, and then eventually she drops the basic form and gets just a Starmie V. Another example, Misdreavus. She gets a more powerful Misdreavus with one version of Mismagus. If this Pokemon has full HP and is knocked out by damage from an attack from your opponent's Pokemon, put 8 damage counters on the attacking Pokemon. And then Eerie Voice for one energy, put 2 damage counters on each of your opponent's Pokemon. But then, in the final version, Mismagus even gets leveled up even more into this version. Your opponent reveals their hand. If they have 4 or more cards in their hand, choose all but 3, and your opponent shuffles the chosen card into their deck. And then Psybeam, your opponent's active Pokemon is now confused. In her deck, and this was mostly due to logistics of having 60 cards, she starts out with Finneon. This Finneon actually comes into this deck and gets paired up with this Lumineon, and then later in the full deck, she doesn't have the Lumineon anymore. She just has the Finneon because that's what I needed for this version of the deck to work with that card. But she gains a Hatenna, and then later evolves into a full tree. The full evolution Hatterene. Once during your turn, you may switch your active Pokemon with one of your bench Pokemon. If you do, your opponent switches their active Pokemon with one of their bench Pokemon. And then Psychic, this attack does 50 damage for each energy attached to your opponent's active Pokemon. So you're usually going to use that Witch Rondo ability more. And then there's this few of different energy or trainer cards that allow you to search for energies, search for your Pokemon, evolve faster, get your energies back from the discard pile and such. So yeah, I hope this gives you a sense for how Irida's deck gets better from state to state, and kind of shows the progression. Because the main idea here is you're going to meet Irida multiple times, and she's usually the nice character. She usually helps you with your stuff, and she's willing to battle you so that you can learn how to make your deck better. So me as the DM of the game, of the RPG, I'm able to control a little bit how what happens to be able to help the player develop their deck and stuff like that. Instead of me as the DM doing it, I'm doing it through the characters in the game, which is always fun because then they meet a character in the world and get to experience more Pokemon. So that is Irida's deck. She has 3 stages in her in the evolution of her deck. Now we're gonna get into the main rival, Thornton, who actually has 5 stages to his deck. For the Thornton deck, his deck goes through a lot of changes. Thornton is meant to be one of the main bad guys of the whole story, and he starts off with kind of his main starter is Meditite, which ends up being a fighting type Pokemon, and then the Prinplup is kind of a fighting type, I guess, in a sense of like they fight in an arena and not necessarily fighting the energy type. His first deck is a Psychic water deck, and it's a 30-card deck, and it's pretty simple, using Wigglytuff and Jigglypuff. This version of Ralts, he's got a Slowpoke and a Girafarig with a variety of trainer cards. His deck is really simple in the beginning, and at the very end, he gets more fighting-type Pokemon, but then he discovers dark Pokemon, and by the end, his deck becomes Psychic Dark, using guys like Darkrai, Crobat, the Single Strike, or Urshifu? I don't know how to say it. Galarian Slowking, and then Gardevoir, and then last of all, Vespiquen and Oricorio. So he has an interesting sense of progression, and let me see if I can explain it the best way that I can. The best way that I think I can explain it is he likes fighting Pokemon, being able to fight in an arena, train them, make them strong. So if you watch the Meditite, he eventually evolves his Meditite into Medicham, and then eventually he levels them up into a more powerful fighting version of Medicham. I actually really like this Medicham. It's one of my favorite cards. It's got this barrage ability, which it says here, the Pokemon may attack twice a turn. If the first attack knocks out your opponent's active Pokemon, you may attack again after your opponent chooses a new active Pokemon. So you can attack with 2 attacks. This first attack heals 30 damage. This one here does 30 damage, and this attack is unaffected by weakness or resistance. So it really doesn't do a lot of damage, but you can deal 60 damage in a turn, which is all right. Usually by the stage that you're at in this game, in this part of the game, so this would be the 3rd deck, it's a pretty powerful Pokemon. I just really like the mechanic there. So he eventually gives up on his Medicham in this scenario. This is the last time he has the Medicham in his deck. But then he moves on to Hitmonchan, which in version 2 of the deck, he gets Hitmontop. So you can imagine in the story that at some point he got this version of the Pokemon and then evolved it into the Hitmonchan. And then that Hitmonchan led him to be able to find Kubfu, which then eventually evolves into the Dark Single Strike Urshifu. I should look up how to say that. So the progression here is he's got a 30 card deck, a 40 card deck, then a 60 card deck, another 60 card deck, and then level 100 60 card deck. One of the other progressions that you can see in his deck is in stage 3 here, he finds a Zubat, and then later is able to evolve that into a Crobat. And then eventually that Crobat evolves into the Crobat V, which is a great utility Pokemon. When you play this Pokemon from your hand onto your bench during your turn, you may draw cards until you have 6 cards in your hand. You can't use more than one draw asset ability each turn. So when you play it, you get to refill your hand, basically. And then 70 damage, your opponent's active Pokemon is now paralyzed. No, poisoned. It says poisoned on there. Another progression is with his Slowpoke. So he's got this version of Slowpoke, which then eventually evolves into this version of Slowking. This Slowking has a utility where once during your turn, you can look at the top 3 cards of either your deck or your opponent's deck and rearrange the order. And then this Slowpoke is also in this version of the deck, number 3 version. He evolves into Slowking. More powerful Slowking. Search your deck for a card and put that onto your hand. Or unarmed, 100 damage. If you have no cards in your hand, ignore all energy in this attack's cost. He doesn't have a Slowking in this version of the deck, but then he eventually gains this version of Slowking. Discard a card from your hand. If you do, draw 3 cards. At the end of your opponent's next turn, the defending Pokemon will be knocked out. A key character that he gains late game is Darkrai. This version of Darkrai, if this Pokemon has any dark energies attached to it, it takes 20 less damage. And Vortex of Darkness, this attack does 20 more damage for each dark energy attached to this Pokemon. And then eventually that Darkrai becomes Darkrai GX. Basically what this attack does is he allows you to take it back from the discard pile. Once during your turn, if this Pokemon is in your discard pile, you may put it onto your bench, then attach a Darkness Energy card from your discard pile to that Pokemon, to this Pokemon. And then the Dark Cleave, 130 damage. This attack damage is unaffected by resistance. And the Dead End GX attack, if your opponent's active Pokemon is affected by a special condition, that Pokemon is knocked out. Darkrai's Restoration ability works really well along with what Thornton himself does. Thornton, as the card, does choose a basic Pokemon in your discard pile and switch it with one of your basic Pokemon in play. Any attached cards, damage counters, special conditions, turns in play, and any other effects remain on the new Pokemon. So what you can do is get a Darkrai out, have him as your active Pokemon, eventually get another Pokemon into your discard pile, and then you can use Thornton to switch them. So then Darkrai is now in your discard pile, and you have a different active Pokemon in Darkrai's spot. and then use that active Pokemon, and then Darkrai is now in your discard pile, and you can then bring Darkrai back with a darkness energy attached. So that works really well, where you get Darkrai out, put another Pokemon in your discard, and you're able to switch them. And so then the Thornton, I really like what this card does, the Thornton. It allows you to play into some really tricky situations where you can like switch into a different type or get a Pokemon back from your discard pile. Which is useful with Darkrai since you can come back from your discard pile as well. So it's just kind of a cool mechanic with these two together. So one of the things that his deck does, Thornton's deck does in the late game, is you're supposed to be able to discard Pokemon like Darkrai and then get him back. And the way you do that is with the Gardevoir here. Corellia and Gardevoir have this same refinement ability. Which says you must discard a card from your hand in order to use this ability. Once during a turn, you may draw 2 cards. So his deck in the late game is all about discarding cards, which Vespiquen can take advantage of, this version of Vespiquen. His B Revenge attack. This attack does 10 more damage for each Pokemon in your discard pile. And so even the Vespiquen, he gains Vespiquen here, and then he eventually levels it up into a version that's used here. So I hope that gives you a sense of how Thornton is able to progress in the story. He has a lot of change, and the goal here is that each version of the deck should be a pretty difficult version for the player to be able to defeat. And it really just depends on the Pokemon type that the player has and the cards that they're getting. I usually will try to make sure that this version, when they encounter Thornton, it's usually a hard enough version that they will probably lose most of the time, so that Thornton becomes like a bad guy. Because the kids, when they play, I'm usually playing with younger kids, teaching them how to play. When they meet Thornton, Thornton is very mean, and he's always like, "Oh, you're gonna lose this one," and he's like very confident with his Pokemon training abilities, and usually he's kind of sassy and like has that type of personality that's, you know, more confident and puts down the player as the opponent, and so he becomes like the bad guy. And that's usually the goal with me as the DM playing these characters, to make Thornton the bad guy in this scenario. So yeah, it's worked out pretty well watching the kids play and find that they don't like Thornton because of the way I portray the character, I guess. And it also shows in the way that his progression works here, where he goes from a kind of lovable little character who has a bad personality, but then his Pokemon end up having those bad personalities as like mean characters and mean things that they do. So, because Darkrai is that way, Crobat, Slowking, where he just knocks out your opponent's Pokemon, they are all kind of mean. So that gives you a sense for how his progression works, and the rivals that are in the season 2 of this Pokemon, my TCG Story. So it was really fun actually putting this together. This was actually the first thing that I did was develop Thornton and Irida's decks, and I was like, oh, I could have a story that goes along, and then the player progresses through, and then the opponents will get better and better, and I kind of like refined the story into a smaller contained version. Whereas in season 1, I had like there were no limits, and I had a lot of play sessions with my daughter, and it was a lot harder to play in season 1 because there was a lot more going on, because my daughter had full access to all the cards, and I had to build more stories, and it took me a lot more prep. Where this, I have a kit that's developed in the box. That's why I always pull back from the box at the beginning of the episodes, because everything can be put in there, and I can haul this around to take to play with my nephew or my niece. And so I've got like the trainers that we talked about today. Here's where all the encounters go. There's some trainers back there that you can play, or these are the rivals here. And then this is all the story stuff. And then this is space for where the player, I can keep their cards. So like this is my nephew's deck that's in there right now. And so having the story be contained in one box where I don't have to go digging for more cards, I can just have everything here and it's ready to go. And there's a sense of progress, and accomplishment for the players when they're developing their decks, so that they can go through the scenarios and defeat harder versions of the enemies. So it makes it a lot of fun for the players when they're playing my TCG Story Season 2. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video and got a sense for the progress and the story that I've developed here. I'll see you guys later. Make sure to like and subscribe this video and check out some of the other content that I've been making about Pokemon. All right, see you guys later. Bye.